So we're going to actually wrap up a section of Matthew. Jesus has been teaching, and as we go through this series of teaching, this is the last chunk of teaching in that segment. So it'll be Matthew 25, verses 31, all the way into chapter 26, verse 5. And I'll start it this way. Lydia and I, she's in the back room. Lydia and I get in trouble together. The fun of having an older, I don't know if she still counts as a toddler, but just cresting out as, she can be my partner in crime. One of our favorite crimes is sneaking up on and scaring Christy. And it's a crime. We're in trouble every time. And I mean, just the other week we were doing it. Christy was sitting over at the stove and she's cooking, so her back is to the rest of the kitchen. Lydia and I come in from the living room, and I don't even think I told Lydia what we were doing. I just got quiet, and I picked her up, and she got really quiet, and I sort of flew her across the kitchen really high so that her head came in right next to Christy's face, and she stayed quiet till she got there, and then went, "Hi!" And then we were both in trouble. But she understood the mission, and we were both all in on it. Suddenly, Christy discovered her daughter was much nearer than she expected, and located somewhere she wasn't expecting either. And she comes in from above. That's not a typical toddler mode. In a much less comical fashion, our passage today has Jesus being found where he wasn't expected either. And it is the response of the people in our passage is surprise. Wait, you were where? How'd that work? How'd we get here? So we're going to talk about the least of these. Jesus is found among his lowly children. Seek him there. All right? Real simple main point. Jesus is found among his lowly children. Seek him there. And we'll unpack what that means. But let me read the passage. You can follow along. So starting in verse 31 of chapter 25. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, and thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick, and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them, saying, "Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. When Jesus had finished saying all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." So today's passage is sometimes called the parable of the sheep and the goats. It shouldn't be called that because it's not a parable. most of what we have here is not parable, but it's just actual events that Jesus is saying, this is what will happen, right? He talks about the Son of Man's coming in glory. That's not a parable. That's going to happen. He talks about the judgment of the world. That's not a parable. That's going to happen. He talks about the basis of that judgment, and that part of it isn't a parable either. So within the account where Jesus is just preaching, just saying, here's what's going to happen, he does use a picture of separating sheep and from goats, and I think that strikes us as a parable because there are other parables about sheep and goats. But here, it's simply an example within a broader teaching. It's probably a simile if you want to be precise. It's not the whole story. He doesn't even call them sheep and goats the whole time. It's just an example of how he's separating out the people, the nations. It's an example of a very real event of Christ seated in judgment, separating the whole world into two groups. They're saying when he judges, there's not 10 groups, 5 groups, it's just 2. And so that's his teaching. Now, I told you last week, originally this was meant to be part of the passage I preached last week, and I broke it off and gave its own week. I took some extended time on this passage in particular because as I got to digging into it, I realized that I might have been teaching it wrong in the past. And anytime you're reading through a passage and you start digging in and you go, wait, that's not what I thought that meant, you need to check yourself. You don't just go, well, it's easier to preach it the way I've been doing it. I got a rut. And so anytime your default read on a passage is off, you have to take some time to double check. And as I dug over these past 2 weeks, I would say if you have sat with me in a Bible study where I've taught this passage before, I think I was wrong in the way I taught it. And I probably taught it in a way that's very popular today and is a message that is true from other passages. So it's not that I think I taught you a heresy or something like that. It's just I missed the point of this passage and taught you something else. Because there is a popular way that this passage is taught today. It's probably the way when you first browsed over it and heard me read it here, that you default take it. And so the default way we tend to think of it is just that what we have here is a passage about serving the needy in our day, and that acts of compassion, in those acts of compassion towards the needy, we encounter Christ in and through those we serve. I have taught it that way. And that can be a very moving message. It's compelling. And in fairness, as I said, I think that's still true. You should minister to needy people. We're called to minister to those in need all across the Bible. So saying this passage might be talking about a different focus doesn't say, well then, I don't have to care about the needy, right? Cover to cover, the Bible's pretty clear. I'll give you a couple examples. Deuteronomy 15:11, for there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land. Proverbs 14:31, whoever oppresses the poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. We could go on. Ephesians 4:28 talks about the thief stopping his stealing and then working with his hands so he has an abundance to give, he says, to everyone in need. James 1:27 says, pure religion is visiting the fatherless and the widow in their affliction. So, help the needy. Yes, amen. That's biblical. But it should strike you a little bit odd where we've been in Matthew and the things we've been talking about to just suddenly veer off into. And by the way, let's be charitable too. That really hasn't been what we were talking about for the last 3 or 4 chapters. We've been looking at Matthew at the transition from the temple and the Old Testament system, from the Jewish leadership as being the center of where God's grace was being revealed and proclaimed in the world, the center of where you found God's presence, moving from that to the church and Christ's disciples as the new heralds of God's message, the church becoming the new temple where God dwells by his Holy Spirit. That's been theologically and content-wise what we've been talking about. More recently, we've been talking about judgment. And our passage continues that, like several others. It's talking about a judgment. And so if you take the words of this passage seriously, it's not merely suggesting, hey, here's some good things you ought to do, if you're looking for extra things to do. He's not just saying, hey, charity's good, but he's talking about a judgment and the basis for whether you enter the kingdom of Christ or join Satan and the fallen angels in hell. And so while the rest of the Bible does encourage care for the needy, that is not the basis of your salvation. So what's up with this passage? Where is it going? How's it fit? What's it saying? Well, anytime you're trying to put a passage together and interpret it, you need to define the different parts. And that's really where I got to reading and realizing I made some modernist assumptions rather than reading original languages and original culture. You have to define the parts. And in this passage, one of the key parts for how you understand the whole picture comes down to just who are these people we're supposed to care for? Who does Jesus intend to see us to see them as? Because that's going to impact how you expect to meet Christ in the passage, where you're going to meet him. This impacts, how we're going to be judged in this passage, because these people are, and our treatment of them is the basis of it. Jesus uses an interesting phrase to define them. It's a mouthful, and it's where I was reading and went, I might have messed up. And I pulled up a bunch of commentaries and went, yeah, I probably messed up. And then I did some study for myself and said, I messed up. Here's verse 40. He says, you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers. Or some of your translations will say my brothers and sisters, which is fine. The Greek word adelphoi is not referring to guys only, but just that familial connection. Again, in verse 45, he says, you did not do it to one of the least of these. So here's the thing. Here's why that phrase should jump out if you've been hanging out, particularly in Matthew for a while, which I forced you to do for the last 3 years. Jesus has used these phrases before. They're not new. And he's actually been really consistent in the way he uses them all through Matthew's gospel. He has made a point, particularly of that word brothers. When Jesus talks about it, he's been pretty emphatic, if you think back to chapter 12, verses 48 and 50, that brothers are not biological kin, but are his disciples. Chapter 12, you remember there's some people are talking about his family, and he says to them, who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And then stretching out his hand towards the disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. He's telling you how he uses this phrase and who he is and is not referring to. If he says, thank you for caring for the least of these, my brothers, it's not like, so we need to figure out who's the biological kin of Jesus, because if you treat them good, you go to heaven. No, he's told you who his brothers are, who his brothers and sisters are. And it's not his biological kin, but his disciples, his spiritual kin. And what's interesting is Jesus in Matthew has always used it that way. And he's used it that way quite a bit. It's a common way he speaks. Chapter 5, chapter 7, chapter 18, chapter 23, along with chapter 12 that I read to you, all have these instances where he talks about my brothers. And it's always fellow believers. It's disciples. It's not used in any generic or general way. And that's the other thing, is our default way of speaking today, we hear brothers and we just think of a common bond of humanity, right? You're all my brothers because we're all sons of Adam. You can maybe make that case from some places in Scripture. It's not really a way Scripture talks so much. It's more of a modern way of talking. But I can tell you this, it's never found in the words of Jesus. That's just not how he uses and talks about humanity. He talks about humanity, and he cares about humanity. He calls them the world, and that God loves the world. So I'm not saying he doesn't love them, but this is our lingo getting in the way of us hearing Jesus, who's been pretty clear, pretty consistent. Nowhere in Matthew, nowhere in the Gospels is brothers and sisters ever used in that modern way that we sometimes now do as referring to all people. The way of speaking isn't seen in the Gospels. Now, that's just part of where I went, who are the? He calls them my brothers. But he doesn't just call them my brothers, right? And it's this mouthful, the least of these my brothers. And in verse 45, he even dropped the brothers off and just said, the least of these. I think he's implying the brothers still in there. But that least of these is also big. It's not a new word. If you remember when we were in chapter 18, we spent quite a bit of time in Matthew 18. Jesus talked about the little ones. Whoever would tempt these little ones would be better than a millstone go around their neck and they'd be cast into the sea. In that place, the word for little ones is the same word as least of these, just a different tense. So he took the little ones and put it into the superlative tense. Same word. And in chapter 18, Jesus talked about us coming to him as little children, as the little ones. And then he spends the whole chapter addressing life inside the community of faith. And you'll find most commentators agree over there that little ones is referring to believers. He's actually telling his disciples, you want to know how to think of who we are, as who my followers are? You think you want to be great and big? We're the little ones. My people are the little ones. My disciples are the little ones. You come as children, and you need to live with this gracious concern for each other as fellow children. We're the least of these. Over and over, Jesus uses it as a reference to believers. And again, when you zoom out and look all through the Gospel of Matthew and the way Jesus talks, we don't really have an example of Jesus in Matthew using the words little ones or least of these, at least when it refers to people, as anything other than referring to disciples. So Matthew 18 seems to be meant to teach them to see themselves with this identity, to change their perspective of what they think a disciple might be. Jesus' disciples are lowly, and they should embrace that compassionately rather than be ashamed of it or despise it. And so now, as we come to this teaching, he puts both of those terms together, and it'd be really hard for any of the disciples sitting there to hear him say, the least of these my brothers, and think he's talking about somebody other than them. And what's interesting is you go into the writings of the early church fathers, all the Greek-speaking ones took it that way too, because they're reading it in the same language and they're catching the same flow. The majority position of how the church has read this over church history is always that this referred to the disciples. It's really a modern reading that ever thought about taking it differently. It's just because we're separate from the culture and the language. So now he puts the terms together, and it makes a much stronger case just from the language, and to be consistent with what Jesus has already said, that the needy in our passage are Christians. So the judgment of the whole world, verse 32 is pretty clear. He judges the nations, the ethne, all the people groups, will be on the basis of how they responded to Christ in his people. And not only does that fit the language that Jesus has used in Matthew, but it fits the surrounding context better too, which is anytime you're trying to interpret a passage, if it fits the passages around it, that's a good sign. We've been talking about the church taking up the mission of bringing the gospel to the world. And so this isn't like we've been talking about this gospel message and now we stop and have a random aside about charity. We're still talking about the church and how the world responds to them and their witness to Christ. And that response is about their eternal salvation. It's still the gospel mission. So if you take it this way, if you see that it's talking about Christ being revealed in his people, not just needy people or general charity, the passage fits what we've already been talking about, the gospel mission and people being brought in. That means that the main point wasn't about your charity to the needy, again, do that anyway, but about the reality that the followers of Jesus will walk in weakness. They will suffer need and loss, and that may tempt many people to look down on them and to dismiss them and to ignore them. And if you do that, you miss Christ. That would be no less of a tragedy than what Jesus reminds us is about to happen to him. He concludes our passage by reminding them in 26 verse 2 that he's about to be delivered up to be crucified. Jesus will show up in weakness. Jesus will be in prison. Jesus will come to his hometown and not be welcomed, to his capital city and not be welcomed. Our Master suffered a lowly death, and his disciples will follow him on the road of humiliation. But what makes the difference for eternity is meeting and receiving Christ. It's not the works you do, but meeting Christ. And you can meet him in his people. So for most of the world, they will receive Christ through the humble, often needy witness of Jesus' disciples. And so there's an invitation to meet Christ in his people. This is not a works salvation where if you do enough charity, you give enough money, practice enough righteousness, you can earn salvation. No, it's about meeting Christ in his people and not letting their weakness hinder you. Salvation remains in and through Christ alone. The main difference then that our passage brings to where we've been in the preceding passages about the gospel mission and the gospel witness is our passage shifts the focus. The past we've been calling believers to witness. I've been for several weeks telling you get out there and share with people about Jesus. Now we're shifting to the perspective of the world responding to that witness. Those who have been sent out walking in the humility and weakness and poverty of their Lord. How's the world going to respond to that? And it's calling the non-believers to respond to the witness, to be willing to meet God in those lowly places. And I think, even though that focus then is more on the world being judged and the need for them to meet Christ and his people, I still think there's much that everybody, believers and non-believers, can take from this passage in the picture it paints of faith meeting Jesus in unlikely places. So, I don't know if I had slides for any of that. I probably did. Yeah, I was just going to make the picture of with the kid bigger. So, there's your list of these. Let me take you through a couple points. One, this idea that Jesus meets us through his people, through his lowly, humble people. There's good news in that. It means you can meet Jesus today. I mean, because one of the things is sometimes, if you're like me, I'm a book guy, so you read books, and every time period you read a book in, you go, man, I wish I lived in that time period. All fiction readers is what we do, right? We read medieval, we think it'd be cool to be there, we don't think about the lack of toilets and stuff, and so then when you read the Gospels, you're like, man, wouldn't it have been cool for me to be there. That's why we like watching videos and movies, reenactments of the life of Christ, because we think about what it would be like to be there, because they got to meet Jesus face to face. But Jesus is saying, everybody gets to meet me. That's not for just people born in the right era. I'm going to reveal myself and meet people through my people. And so you can meet Jesus today. Many a person has cried out for God to reveal himself to them. And here you have God telling you where to find him. You meet him, even receive him in the humble way his people follow him in this life. Rather than demanding God come and meet you in your way, in your places of comfort, as though you're God and he has to bow to you, would you be willing to join us in the foolishness of faith? We're taken as silly and backwards and simple by the world. We are the needy that they look down on. But Jesus says you'll meet the king down here, not up in some lofty castle. The charity that you need is a charitable heart towards those you tend to despise. That's what opens the door to you meeting Jesus in his lowly saints. Our passage doesn't say that they needed to break the prisoner out of jail, to heal the sick. Just be willing to go to them, to visit them in that humble state. He's talking about a heart disposition. It's sharing a meal with them and welcoming them. Because when you open your door to a Christian, you open your door to Jesus dwelling within them. When you sit at table with a Christian, you sit and break bread with Jesus. That's what he's getting at. There's a short little book I read with some of our small group leaders by Michael Frost called Surprise the World. And he recommends a simple acrostic for Christians to use as a basic Christian discipline. He calls it BELLS, which I've got it spelled out for you. BELLS stands for Bless, Eat, Listen, Learn, Sent. Not the like smoothest running acrostic, but it works. And what he takes is that a healthy Christian should pray and give tangible blessing to somebody, should eat with someone, listen to someone, learn from someone, and reach out to someone, be sent to someone every week. That's his. Those 5 letters represent his weekly goals as a Christian. He views that this is just a baseline of Christian living. Now, I don't care if you use the BELLS acronym. I haven't personally used that one as my go-to. you can make up a goal of your own. But his point was just that Christianity should never be alone or individual. You can't take a passage like this where Jesus says, I'm going to meet you through people and say, and then I'm going to do my faith all by myself. That's going to be a faith that never meets Jesus. Makes sense when you see our passage expecting Jesus to be revealed through interactions with his people. It's not good for you to be alone. It's not good for the world around you. So I like the title of his book, Surprise the World. This is Lydia floating across the kitchen to show up next to Christy. You're going to meet somebody. You didn't expect him there. You need to sit with other Christians. The lost around you need to sit with believers and have fellowship with you, because that's where Jesus shows up in nicer ways than Lydia, Spook, and Christy. What I'm saying for us is open the door to Jesus through Christian fellowship. Passages like this make it vital. Tom.
Start, and I think, kind of moved past it, but are you saying that what you didn't get before in this passage is that he was talking mainly to disciples and those people who were already part of his ministry, like committed to him?
No, it's not who he's talking to, it's who he's talking about. When he says you do it to the least of these, he's not talking about just any needy person you find, anybody in prison, anybody sick, because we tend to take this as a general call to global charity, which you should care for the poor, and it's fine. That call's still on. But we take the passage as saying, so you meet Jesus when you just care for any needy person. So if I go find a person who's not a believer, but they're in prison, and I visit them, I'm going to meet Jesus in a special way through them. That's the way we've normally preached. Well, it's not the way it's historically been preached. It's the way it's lately been preached. It's a pretty recent reinterpretation. But Jesus was talking about the needy, and the least of these was Christians. He says, you meet me when you meet me in Christians who are living humbly for me.
Group of disciples
Anybody who's
that
believing
were
in...
hanging out with them.
I actually think it's not too complex of an idea. Anybody who's put their faith in Jesus has Jesus living in them.
Right.
So you can meet Jesus with anybody who has Jesus living in them. What gets in the way of that? We look down on each other. Well, that guy's sick. That guy's in prison. He's got issues. We live in a culture that looks down on Christians. We've always been called as Christians to live in humble ways, to take a road that puts us to be viewed as the least of these and the nobodies. So why don't people just meet Jesus all the time? Because they don't want to hang out with other Christians. And it's not just non-believers who struggle with whether they want to hang out with Christians. We turn that same lens on each other, and we won't hang out with each other. I've talked to Christians who say, I'd rather hang out with non-believers. They're more hospitable, and and so we look down on, we see these people as least of these, and we don't see that as a call to lean in, but as an excuse to pull away. That's what I think the passage is calling out and saying, yes, we do look like people to ignore. We're sick. We're tied up. We're the stranger that you don't want to welcome. We are strange because we're not perfect. We're humble, broken people who confess our brokenness.
Separated are true Christians who have accepted Christ, and then what, nominal Christians who...
No, it's he's talking to the whole world. The message is global. That's why I say he's not preaching to Christians. He says when the Son of Man sits on his throne and judges the nations, the ethne, all people groups, everybody will be judged on whether they met and received Jesus. That's basic gospel logic. He's just saying you tend to meet and receive Jesus through his people. That the way the gospel goes out is Christ in his people being met and received by others. And so if you are outside of Christ, one of the things you're going to have to get over is if you want to meet Jesus, you need to go hang out with his people. And that's often the issue. I've talked to many non-believers who say, I want God to reveal himself. Well, come out to my church. I don't want to go to those hypocrites. I don't want to be around those people. What if that's where you find him, is through his people? Well, they're messed up. Yeah, they are. And if you could humble yourself and have a graciousness of heart to meet his broken, messed up, undeserving people, what you'd find is Jesus shows himself through his broken, messed up, undeserving people. It's not because we're so great. In fact, the whole logic of the passage is we're not great. come hang out with us anyway, because Jesus shows up through his people. So the big thing is to say, it's not just, well, if you do enough soup kitchens, you can meet Jesus there. Because if you do any charitable work, you meet Jesus. We've kind of made that into a vague mysticism that allows you to meet Jesus without any Christians involved and without any gospel preaching involved. And I think that really doesn't fit the Bible. What Jesus is saying, no, I put myself in my people. And if you want to meet me, you can meet me in my people if you can get over the way you tend to look down on them, think you're better than them, or think you don't have to serve them. Come meet my people. The world will be judged on the witness of the church, whether it was received. And the world is going to have to decide whether they're willing to humble themselves and meet us in our lowly estate. Every generation of Christians has been looked down on. That's not going to change. But we invite them to say, come into this crazy, lowly place, because you find Jesus down here. And so that's where I'm saying Christian fellowship becomes a really sacred thing when you realize Jesus likes to reveal himself in those little gatherings of Christians. And that's why you as a believer, and certainly if you're hearing this and you're outside the community of faith, you need to come hang out with Christians if you want to meet Jesus. He's revealing himself through the church, through his people. And so open the door to Jesus through Christian fellowship. You want to see more Jesus? Make a firm decision to get together with Christians. This is as true for other Christians as it is for non-Christians. It's a global message to everybody. Jesus reveals himself through his people. You need Christians in your life. You can't get this blessing that this passage is talking about if you isolate yourself from believers. This is not what anyone is called to. The invitation to the whole world is, come on in. Every week you need encouraging conversations with believers. You need to step out to believers who have needs and join them in that broken place. Because it's with a believer in a state of need that you get to see this unique grace of Jesus showing up. To invite them to share a meal with you, to reach out to them and welcome. All of those are pictured in our passage. And the question you have to ask is, how often do those show up in your week? How often is Christ hidden because of our private, individualistic lifestyles? Let's get dinner sometime. That's not a figurative, like, seriously. Let's get dinner sometime. Talk to Christy. You can come to us, we can go to you. It doesn't have to just be me. Grab somebody else in this church. Say, hey, I need you in my life. Let's hang out. Let's get together. How can I help you in your need? How can I welcome you in your strangeness? But don't wait. You initiate it. You can meet Jesus today. Actively seek Christ and his people. And I'm going to tack on something that's not here. I got a call on my way to church here from one of our guys at St. Paul's this morning. He said, hey, I am already running your sermon. He went out to eat after church, and he bumped into some other church people at the restaurant. So he talked with them. And there was one other thing that happened at the restaurant, but then he forgot something at church, so he drove back to church to get it and ended up talking to some folks around the building after he got back. So here's been 3 hours since he's been out of this, got away from the sermon, and he's already sat with and been encouraged by 3 other interactions with believers. And he was talking, he's like, it was life-giving. It was just encouraging to meet these different people and to build each other up. And he says, so he's like, I'm loving your sermon this week. So here's your challenge. You got 3 hours after our service ends to beat the morning service. There's a joy there. There's a life there because Jesus shows up in our gatherings. You need that. You need to seek it. Prioritate it. 2, the second thing I want you to catch that's, I think, really cool from this passage. All people were meant for Jesus' kingdom. That's why I kept saying he's not just talking to the disciples. This blessing is for everybody because he's talking about everybody and where everybody belongs. Our passage is about judgment and where everybody ends up. And it's a global topic. Again, verse 32 says to the nations. Therefore, the statements that Jesus makes about those destinations, where you get judged and where you go, are global too. And so note this, verse 34. He says to the one group, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. This kingdom was, from the very beginning, prepared for anyone, anywhere, who would believe. You don't just get lumped in as a second thought extra. From the foundation of the world, it was made for you. You belong in this kingdom. It was not meant to be a Jewish-only kingdom or American-only or a Western-only kingdom or whatever. All the nations, all the peoples are called to this kingdom that was prepared for them. At the same time, what's striking is he describes the kingdom that way. That's not how he describes hell. Look in verse 41. He says, "Then he will say to those on the left, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" The kingdom was prepared for people. Hell was not prepared for people. That wasn't why it was built. The eternal fire was made for Satan, for the devil, and for his angels. That's who it's for. But you can join them if you choose not to embrace Jesus and his people. The eternal kingdom of Jesus is not just an escape from hell. In fact, you could argue that's not even what it's primarily about, because he made the kingdom for us and he didn't make hell for us. So he didn't make the kingdom so we could get out of hell. It's about belonging. You are to be an heir of something that was planned from eternity with you in mind. That's where you belong. Hell is the afterthought. Life in and with Jesus was plan A. Coming to Jesus isn't just escaping hell. It's finding your true identity. It's being rescued from all the things that degrade your humanity, from the bondage of the devil and all his kind, to return to what the world was meant to be, the plan prepared, to who you were meant to be. Now, I'm convinced this is a message that speaks very deeply to the need in our day. I've shared on this before, but between the prevalence of fractured families, skyrocketing rates in our day, and the statistics you read don't tell the whole story, because most of the families never got married in the first place. When they say divorce rates, that's of the few that got married. Between the fracture of families and the heightening mobility of our current generation, of which I am definitely a poster child, traveled all over the world and married somebody on the opposite end of the globe, the vast majority of young people today have a feeling of rootlessness and otherness. They don't know where they belong and they don't know who they are. They feel like guests and strangers. They feel like home and identity, and you can hear this in the way we talk in our films, home and identity are things they're still waiting to discover rather than something that they have and we're building on. So that's just a snapshot of our culture. But sadly, instead of Christians in the church offering the gospel as this healing balm to that brokenness, that lostness, our churches have spent the last couple decades doing the same thing. Right? We're always trying to reinvent ourselves and rearrange ourselves, and as though we don't have any roots either. Your home has no roots, neither does your church. Welcome. Constantly church hopping and splitting churches. This makes the church like another fractured family. We are part of the eternal kingdom that is a refuge from all of that. And what I want you to understand is we're not waiting for Christ's kingdom to finally emerge and show up. It's been here all along. That plan's not being sketched out. It was written from the foundations of the world. You have a place of belonging with Christ's people wherever you find them. Already. In whatever state you find them in. Humble as they may be. Our belonging doesn't go forwards to something we're trying to build and create. It looks backwards to what Christ has already done. It's not something we have to figure out and build. I'm not saying our church can't grow and improve. I'm just saying we don't grow and improve and then suddenly we arrive at being the kingdom of Christ. No, when you came to faith, you got adopted in the kingdom of Christ, and it's a beautiful thing. It tells you who you are. There's roots here. There's substance here. And on top of that, we're growing quickly or slowly, poorly or well, because that's the extra. The church should have this stable foundation that was received by faith and found in Jesus. And so when you come into God's people, you find a home. You find an identity. You're adopted in. You become an heir of the kingdom that was prepared for you. You belong here. As we are now, not as we will someday be. So, humble yourself to find yourself. You don't look deep inside to create a sense of identity by taking pride in your personal brokenness and wearing it as a label or a badge. We all stand separated from God. And in our fallen state, the way of Jesus looks embarrassing. That's why you can't look elsewhere to find it. You're going to have to humble yourself and go where you didn't want to go. It looks embarrassing. It looks like sickness, and prison, and nakedness. It seems so backward to think that in stooping to the needy, you find your heart's treasure. But that's what Jesus says. If you can lay down who you think you are and what you think you are entitled to, you can meet him in the very people you were tempted to despise. Christians go out to the world as the rejects of the world, but we offer them the treasures of heaven. And in meeting him, you actually find a greater, higher, and more lasting identity. When you go to his lowly ones, to the least of these, with whom you might be tempted to take exception, you find instead belonging. When you meet with believers, would you be open to finding a new identity through Jesus in them? You willing to be embarrassed enough to hang out with me and my friends? Not because we're cool. We're not. Any of you who have seen me in an office know I'm not. For whatever gifts I do have, I'm not administratively anything. It's not that we're so awesome. It's just that we have Jesus. And if you come with that humble, open heart, you can meet Jesus in his broken people. It's Jesus that you need. It doesn't say hang out with prisoners so you get a prison smell on you. You go visit the prisoner and you meet Jesus there. Would you consider this week what parts of your brokenness you have made your identity? Instead of looking to Jesus' eternal plans for you, believing that he has something he planned from the foundations of the world, it's who you really are and where you belong. You are called to be an heir, not accursed. Where do you find your sense of belonging? It needs to be in Jesus, and Jesus met in the gathering of his people. Last point. Okay, now this is the point you're like, you've said this 100 times. You can't make that another point. The gospel spreads through the lowly. And you're like, we heard you say that. I know at this point you've heard it a ton, but there's a side to that I want to say that because it's directly targeted at American Christianity and American culture, something that not just Christians need to hear, but we Christians need to hear. In saying that it's through the lowly that this happens, we're rejecting one of the cultural values of our day. We are a culture that worships celebrity and equates fame with power. Turn your TV, pick any reality TV show. It wouldn't even get watched if we didn't have those values. That's not how the gospel works. We're this culture, I want to make it big, and power is fame, right? The gospel doesn't need fame to spread. We make it seem like the more big names that would come to Jesus, that maybe that would be the sparks of revival in our land. And so we write all kinds of articles and share all these social media posts anytime an actor or a musician or a model makes even the vaguest statement regarding faith. We're like, woo, because that's going to be, that's the win, right? If we get a name to be a Christian, then Christianity's winning. It's buying into this cult of celebrity and fame. American churches tend to look for their pastors to be celebrities. As pastors, we're told writing books and wearing the right outfits is a key to our success. I'm failing on both. No money was harmed in the making of my clothing. We want our worship teams to be recorded bands with albums on Spotify. Everything we touch, we got to figure out how to make a celebrity out of it, or it's not cool and we're not succeeding. We look to all these things as the established roads to success and growth. When we do that, we are completely writing off the logic of this passage. This passage just doesn't even live in that world. The gospel doesn't need Justin Bieber. Look, he's welcome like everybody else. But the gospel spreads through a million nameless saints whose lives were never great in the eyes of the world, but humbly followed their master in the way of the cross. That's why Jesus ends it and says, remember, I'm about to get crucified. That's what I'm talking about. Do you believe that our church can have an impact for eternity? Can be a channel for the lost to be adopted into the eternal family of Jesus, even if you and I have forgettable names and never have a fame that reaches beyond the seats in this room? We often are careful not to say it out loud. We know we shouldn't think that way. But many Christians judge their personal faith and their churches by fame and celebrity instead of humble gospel witness. I want to go to that church. They have such and such. I took a mission trip. We had a stop in Tennessee. I got to stay in Michael W. Smith's barn and go to church with him. And even went to his son's birthday party. And I had a whole bunch of folks. So did you met Michael W. Smith? And what, I'm like, I went to church. I actually was listening to the sermon, not tracking the celebrity in the back. What do we, does the church cooler if he goes there? I can tell you he would say no. He was just stacking chairs in the back. It's about humbly following Christ and having a gospel witness. It's not about names. Because when you adopt this idea of celebrity and fame, then you have this idea of you're just still waiting to make it big in your faith, make it big in your Christian life. Or you're waiting for our church to make it big, because apparently that's always the goal. Are you still waiting to make it big, or are you ready to accept the already present, already available life of Jesus by grace through faith in our little fellowship and in your life, in your little corner of Pennsylvania? We're not waiting till something bigger happens. He's here. He's meetable now. If you have him, you have what you need. It's been said, start getting to political commentary, one of the unique elements of how Americans wrestle with wealth and class and things like that is that all Americans see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We're all sure that we can get there. We're going to be one. And I know politician commentators go lots of different ways on that. I am not interested in getting into that. It's not why I raised it. It's just I think there's something, especially as somebody who's traveled the world, that's really inherent to the American psyche in our just huge personal grandeur. It's very hard for us to accept that not all of us will make it big, whether that's financially or socially or whatever. We're all just sure we're a hair away from being the next big something. Statistically, the math says that's not going to be true of most of us. A couple of you might become famous. A couple of you might get wealthy, but not all of us. But there's this outsized longing that, well, I know not everyone can, but I'll be one of the ones that does. We all kind of think that way. What if God delights to use you for his kingdom in humble obscurity? Can you swallow that? Would you be okay with that kind of a calling, or would that be an embarrassment? Look, we're not against wealth. We're not against celebrity. But we just want to guard our hearts from making them into idols. We don't look to them to deliver God's promises. That's the issue. We don't need more money or more fame to get the gospel out there. The gospel has the stuff to do its job. He'll do it in his own way, and he's told us to expect it to show up in the ways that are underappreciated in our world. So this is less about what you do or do not have, and more about what you value. And we're encouraging on that to love the lowly, to delight in the way God loves to work through humble, obscure things. It's just one of the cool things all through the Bible. He takes the nobodies and he uses them anyway. He takes the undeserving, the failures, the sinners. He goes to the sick, and there he reveals himself. Love the lowly. Learn to accept and appreciate what is humble about our Christian life. What is humble about our Christian fellowships and gatherings? Jesus didn't wait for people to get cool enough to reveal himself through them or to them. He came to the rejects, and he delights to be found among them. And so as you think about understanding this idea that he comes in the humble, we don't have to obtain or accomplish anything to have Jesus among us and vibrantly, powerfully working in our midst, then what you need to catch is, what are those conditions you've set up? Maybe it's not fame. Maybe, I picked an American hobby horse, but we all have these things of, I get here and then I'm a good Christian. I get here and then Jesus can use my life. Or if our church would just get this figured out or fixed, then we'd be, the cool church in Ephrata. What are the when I conditions you put on Jesus working powerfully in your life and in our church? Because I'd like to ask you to surrender those things and expect Jesus to already be powerfully present through his people. He's saying in their weakness, in their prison, in their nakedness, in their sickness, in their being strangers and newness and unwelcomeness, in all of this, that's where he meets the world and calls the world to himself. And when the world misses that, he doesn't say, my bad, world. If those Christians had just had their act together and been cooler, you'd have met me, and you get a pass. He says, I show up in weakness and humility. You meet me there. And if you meet me, you come into my kingdom. If you don't meet me, you don't. The world is judged on whether they receive Christ. They receive Christ through God's people, as we are today, even in our weakness and loneliness. So I want to encourage you, put the conditions aside, to delight in the fact that God wants to use you, the broken mess you are today. He has said that's where you meet him. The least of these, Jesus is found among his lowly children. Seek him there. Seek him for yourself and share him as you do. So I'm going to put two questions up for discussion. One, how can you pursue Christian fellowship beyond the Sunday service? If we're saying you need to meet Jesus through his people, how are you going to get with Jesus' people? How do you do that? How can you do that? Two, how can we look for Jesus in the humble things of our church and Christian friends? So one is, going and being with people, but this is a call for the world to seek and to find him. Not just go hang out with Christians to have a fun social club. You're there to meet Jesus. So how do you look for Jesus when you get with other believers? It would be a shame to hang out with a whole bunch of people filled with Jesus and not meet Jesus. All right, so we're going to leave those up on the screen. I'll let you guys break up into one or two groups and take some time just to discuss as we